In 1932, Peter Brunnan wrote the Montgomery Advisor a short history of the pioneer graves of Fort Mitchell. This was frontier country, a fur trading post first documented in 1795, although it was known and visited by white explorers who arrived decades before. Adventure seekers settled down with freed slaves and Indians, leading to a vibrant mixed-race community that horrified early settlers of Columbus. A fort was built here on the Alabama side of the river in 1813. The first burial here was that of John Ward, a young man who somehow came to live in the Upper Creek Nation. How he came to settle among the Indians at Wetumpka is anyone's guess, but he seems to have come with his father, who succumbed to disease before the fort was built. His dying father gave the child to Daniel McDonald, a local white trapper. He was the translator for the general building the fort. Before 1813 was over, he had died of disease, as had his father. One of the most fascinating men buried here is old Tom Carr, of whom very little is recorded. He was sometimes called Tom the Englishman, but he named his son Paddy Carr, indicating that he might have come from Ireland. Odd circumstances lead me to think he might have been assassinated. When famed revolutionary patriot the Marquis de Lafayette arrived in 1825, old Tom Carr supposedly fell down a well at Capitol Hill and met his end. Why would old Tom have been killed? Well, consider the political climate at the time. Game, like deer, had become very hard and scarce to find for the Lower Creek, who lived in the parts of the river close to white settlement, and they agreed to sign away their lands in central Georgia in the 1821 Treaty of Indian Springs. This was seen as a concession by most Creek people who viewed it as a necessary evil. However, it created two distinct groups within Creek society: the Lower Creek, who embraced white settlement, and the Upper Creek, who wanted a traditional way of life. Tom, as an Englishman, was in position to negotiate with settlers. He had seen the depredations against the Indians firsthand. While he and his son Paddy had both been supporters of the 1821 treaty, the 1825 treaty angered the whole of the Creek Nation. A few mostly white Creek men from the Lower Creek towns had agreed to hand over all Creek land in Georgia so long as they were paid very handsomely and got to keep their own cabins and slaves. A month after the treaty was signed, Tom Carr found himself in Mobile, attempting to meet the revolutionary patriot Lafayette, who was having counsel with the governor. And just before this meeting, he just so happens to fall down a well. It sounds suspicious to me. Consider the fact that his son Paddy was at that moment protesting the 1825 treaty in the city of Washington, where he acted as a translator. However, Paddy Carr didn't think that revolt was an answer. Believing he could negotiate with the settlers, he joined the white men of his father's blood at Fort Mitchell and brought in Friendly Creek to crush the rebellious bands. Still, in 1836, when Creeks were removed to Oklahoma, he had his land seized and joined them on their march west. Some of the earliest settlers here were wounded patriots of the Revolutionary War. They likely had PTSD, and like many men from Ashley's 100, they headed west to be away from their people and live off the grid. General Thomas Woodward encountered one of these men, whom he called Lame Bob Walton, or Timor Bob. Men like Timor Bob would live in the Creek Nation because the Creek were the only tribe who would extend citizenship to anyone who would live among them in peace, but these folks still tended to help their European brothers when they came calling. Timor Bob was the translator for the Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins and provided his services to Catch Bowles, who was captured and sent to Havana. Walton was friends with figures like William Weatherford, Sam Manack, and dozens of other Creek warriors who felt that helping American settlers would benefit them. The most celebrated grave here is that of Timpucci Bernard, whose story is repeated countless times by the unmarked dead resting in the forest here. The son of a British officer who settled among the Indians after the Revolution, he was half Indian. His father, like most early settlers, married Indian women, understanding that Indian society was matriarchal and her land would be passed on to him. Timpucci helped early settlers, believing plantations and American-style slavery would benefit them. He saw solemnly understood that the game had dried up here in Alabama. Where a Creek man could gather 300 deer in the 1730s, he'd be lucky to shoot 10 now. In 1813, he joined General Floyd in leading a band of Uchis in the Creek War, where they massacred the last rebelling bands of Creek at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. A victorious Andrew Jackson celebrated, but quietly sent word to Georgia to have militia burn the homes of the Uchis and Creek who had helped them. Like Old Tom, who went to Mobile to protest, and Tom's son, Paddy Carr, Tim Pucci protested the Treaty of 1825, but it was too late. In spite of his service directly under Andrew Jackson, his family was sent to Indian Territory, with all the rest in 1836. Tim Pucci had died in 1834, 2 years prior to Indian removal. Fort Mitchell was outlaw country. The Crowell family and their associates rest a quarter-mile away from the military graves, and they have a fascinating story all their own. Buried here is a young Thomas Burnside, killed in a duel with George Crawford. In those days, Alabama wasn't yet a state, so gentlemen of honor could take their affairs over the border and settle matters like men. Thomas was actually the uncle of Union General Ambrose Burnside and had been killed in a dispute over newspaper articles published a year prior about George's father. John Crowell is another fascinating man, born 1785 in North Carolina. In 1818, the territorial legislature of Alabama elected him to serve as their only congressman, which he did, taking up residence at the fort. In 1821, James Monroe made him an agent to the Creek Indians, which he was able to fulfill until their removal in 1836. This previous agent had been removed after it was discovered that he was pocketing the money meant for the Indians and importing slaves for resale to them. Crowell raised racing horses on his 18,000-acre plantation, which he secured from the Creeks before they were even removed. Like most men in this cemetery, he never married. He left most of his inheritance to a black girl named Caroline and a mulatto named Henry. This suggests that early settlers here were very open to having children with other races, but not usually to marrying them. And what's more, I was told at the museum that beyond this wall you have what are believed to be the graves of slaves. They were buried outside of the main cemetery. Usually they had no markers, but you can still see the divots in the ground. And because these settlers had died here in the 1830s, you can surmise that this also very likely would have been an Indian burial ground. After all, Fort Mitchell was placed on a hill overlooking the Chattahoochee, so a hill would be a very natural place to bury your dead. And this area, before Columbus was settled, was called by Europeans who arrived here Sodom. It was a very mixed race area, so they got very terrified at the idea of freed slaves mixing with Scottish fur trappers and Revolutionary War soldiers and Indians. So a lot of those men would have been buried here, or at the old Linwood Cemetery where they were buried on top of for the Columbus sites.